On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. Three men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these three men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him, and the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong, and then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fist and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in three places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poke their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away, and as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out "thief," although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the three men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusko Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Eva was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Eva's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week. As they were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds had been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Eva, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day. Eva took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Eva's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, 2 large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Eva, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Eva and the other 2 people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Eva and the other 2 paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all 3 paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, but the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other 2, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Eva, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Eva anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Eva was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right, and the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus. So by all accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped, and so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team. When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive, because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well. But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable. And so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear. And when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective, is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high, unprotected, and lived to tell the tale. Until Ava. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave." And so Deborah said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream." And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, "Honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now." And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence, and then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it, and she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, "Hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah at this point is now terrified, and she's saying, "No, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her." And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes, and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, "Yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary." And Deborah would say to police, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there." And they would tell her that, "We believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there." And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asked them, "What happened? What did you see?" And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the terrain kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her. And then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bully and Bend and found Nikki alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt.
As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my podcast, the Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. But that's not all. In addition to that podcast, under the Ballin Studios umbrella, there is a whole host of other podcasts that you can binge right now, and their content, all of them, fall into the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious category. For example, if you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, you should go check out my other podcast called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear from some other voices within our studio, like Luke LaManna. Luke LaManna is a military veteran. He has a super iconic, really deep radio voice, and he has 2 shows. One is called Wartime Stories, where he basically looks at strange, dark, and mysterious wartime stories, and his other show is called Redacted, where he looks at information that used to be classified, and he dives into it with his military expertise and experience, and he basically shows you the lies and secrets and half-truths that the most powerful institutions in the world have been keeping from us. We also have shows that are just plain creepy and unsettling, like Bedtime Stories, hosted by Richard Weil, where he dives into the supernatural and cryptids and mysterious deaths. I mean, basically his whole kind of niche is things that keep you up at night. And then 2 other shows that fall into that sort of unsettling, creepy vibe are Late Nights with Nexpo, hosted by the famous YouTuber Nexpo, where he dives into true, crazy, scary stories. And then we also have another show called Run Fool, hosted by Rodney Barnes. And Rodney is like an icon in the horror genre at large. And on his show, he just dives into this wild, chilling lore, like horror lore. People love that show. Or if you're a history buff, you need to check out our new hit show called A Twist of History. It's hosted by Joel, who also has an amazing YouTube channel. It's called Let's Read. And on A Twist of History, he dives into epic stories that have shaped the world that we live in now. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, go check out these shows. You can look for them either by name or simply by looking for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform. They are available right now. Enjoy.
In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him him, yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here, what's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie, it's good to have you back here, man," and then walked off. And so Bobby's like, what is going on here? And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door and he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door and Bobby's like, oh great, who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not? So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there, and this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student said, "Is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, "Yeah." And so the student goes, "Okay, my name is Michael and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin." At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you because they love Eddie and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back. After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth, they hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie. And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey Eddie, my name's Bobby, and everybody thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house, and right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing and they hugged and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kellman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his, and they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kellman. I was born July 12th, 1961, and I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me, and one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin. After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork!" So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like, even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen, that it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school, we all smoked the same cigarettes, we liked the same food, we had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms, and on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had 2 identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story. And in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency. And right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone. And he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella. And he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets, and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business, and it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the three brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks, and then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the two brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowicz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become, or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup, that we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third hand information. But what we do know for sure is the surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in this study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study, and so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers. On December 18th, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants who all claimed to be the same person. And this person who they claimed to be was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy, and that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show. But there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Ed Edwards, and he would say that Ed at one point was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer, and then after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around, and then upon release from prison 14 years later, Ed remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify con men and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Ed Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past, and then after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Ed Edwards was revealed.
Will the real Ed Edwards please stand up?
And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Ed Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American, middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended, and then the world forgot about Ed Edwards. Until 2009. That year, Ed's estranged daughter, 40-year-old April Blasio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and this stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move, sometimes in the middle of the night, and April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, oh, well, you know, I was an informant when I was in jail and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we gotta move. April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna start Googling some stuff. So she hops in her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left this wedding and they had driven down this dead-end road and they were just kind of enjoying each other's company when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Ed Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that, I think my father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so the police said, okay, we'll go have a look. And so the Watertown police, they tracked down Ed Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched the samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so Ed Edwards, he was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin, and as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then he requested the death penalty. But he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty. You're still facing life in prison. And so frustrated, Ed revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later in 2011 before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No, when he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him, and there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases, and so unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone, and so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window, and so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Genelin Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. But when police went to the Tromp family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Tromp family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going, and the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot of pressure on our family and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them, there was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was. She was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn Hospital where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Genelin Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yas in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Tromp family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer, and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement, apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Tromp family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we're just going to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Tromp family was suffering from something called folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness of two. What happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Tromps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this folie à deux theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Tromps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bebo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bebo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot if they were inside of the aircraft to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bebo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch, that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bebo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bebo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bibo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bibo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018, none of them have an answer. On that fateful day, at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport, where Bibo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bibo arrived at Cargo 1, and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bibo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bibo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1 hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bibo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bibo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bibo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bibo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bibo kind of laughs it off and says, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down. And so as Bibo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bibo to stop what he's doing, and Bibo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bibo becomes remorseful, and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day, and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bibo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy, and he's got a couple of screws loose, and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bibo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, but at this point, Bibo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bibo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bibo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down,
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side and about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. I think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, now I'm just gonna nose down and call it a night.
How Bibo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bibo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards this stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was, and then before the guy could do anything, the slide sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out, and she ran over to him, and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman, and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van, and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair, and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman, and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what, I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out, and she rushed over to the truck, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down, and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, "I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation?" And Robert said, "Sure." The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out, and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert, and as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew, and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taken the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other 2 to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below. And the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other two fishermen to get up. And so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water. And so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm going to call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel. He grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other two fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into this ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all four men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation. And even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. And it was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer. And then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all four of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. Totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened, and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? They're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. We're not talking days here. This is going to be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the 4 men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other 3 could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time, and Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other 3 were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not going to make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do one 5.5 mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2 mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all the salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you gotta remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's gonna make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other 2. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you. And then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds, and he climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes. He can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way. There's already a ship out here. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other 2 fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan, they scooped him up, and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other 2 fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. He swam back to the hull of the ship. We got to go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other 2 fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other 2 fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining 2 crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist. And, it was possible that Nathan, in his very deteriorated state, had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others. And so eventually the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other 2 were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other 2 fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence, but to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fisherman. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others, and maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing. On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities. And again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion.
2007, 60-year-old Michael Dick was living in Bow, East London with his wife and 2 daughters. While his life was not exactly exciting, it was good. He lived in a quiet and safe neighborhood, and Michael, who used to be a carpenter, was now semi-retired and got to spend the bulk of his time with his friends and family. But that year, something really started to bother him. 10 years prior, Michael had split up with his first wife, and after their divorce was finalized, his ex-wife and the daughter they had together, her name was Lisa, and she was 21 at the time, those two stayed in the family home in Sudbury, England, and Michael moved south about an hour and a half to Bow, East London. The divorce had been quite messy, and so Michael had not only lost touch with his ex-wife, he had also lost touch with Lisa.
And so fast forward 10 years back to 2007, and Michael and Lisa had not spoken since the divorce, and Michael found himself suddenly feeling this unbelievable wave of grief over the loss of his relationship with his first child. And so after speaking with his current wife and his 2 other daughters, he decided that he had to go find Lisa. He had to be reunited with her. The only problem was he didn't know where Lisa lived, he didn't have her contact information, and he didn't know where his ex-wife was, so he couldn't even ask her how to get in touch with Lisa. However, he did have the street address of where they used to live in Sudbury, England, and so he decided that would be his starting point. So in August of that year, Michael and his 2 other younger daughters, they hopped in the car and they left Bow, East London, and they headed up to Sudbury. And when they got there, Michael navigated to his old street, which had brick houses lining each side of the road, and he drove down until he spotted his old house, and he parked right out front, and then he alone hopped out of the car and he walked up to the front door. He took a deep breath and then he knocked on the door. When the door opened, it was not Lisa, it was not his ex-wife, it was some other family that he didn't know, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife, and so they said, good luck finding your daughter, but we don't have any information for you. And so Michael was crushed, but he thanked them and turned around, back in the car, and told his daughters to learn. And from there, the trio just began driving around Sudbury, half looking for Lisa out on the streets, although none of them thought they would actually find her, and then also kind of discussing what they were going to do next, because now they had nothing. And so as they're driving around the streets of Sudbury, they come to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa is putting some sort of story in the local newspaper that hopefully she would see, and then she would contact Michael. And so they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and they went inside and they managed to speak to a reporter. And after telling the reporter Michael's story about how he's lost touch with Lisa, the reporter thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting story, and I'd be happy to do a small feature on you guys. And so the reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his 2 daughters outside. They took a picture of them, and then they told Michael, in the next edition of the paper that will run in a couple of days, we'll run this picture along with a little write-up about how you're looking for Lisa, and we'll put your contact information in there, and hopefully she sees it and she reaches out to you, and you can be reunited and live happily ever after. And so Michael thanked the reporter and the photographer, and then he and his other 2 daughters hopped in the car and headed back to Bow, East London. In 2007, at the same time that Michael was beginning his search for Lisa, Lisa was actually beginning to think, you know what, I want to go find my dad. Lisa was now 31 years old. She had 3 kids of her own. She was married. She had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. And she was thinking, I really want to have a relationship with my dad again so that my kids can have a relationship with him. And so she began speaking with her mother and with friends about how she should go about finding her dad, because like Michael, she didn't have his contact information. She didn't have a phone number. She didn't know anyone who would. And then when she went on social media to look for him, he wasn't on there, and so she was kind of at a loss. Then, one day in August, she was at her office, and she was in the break room, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting out on the coffee table. So she picked it up, and she began flipping through the pages, and then suddenly she stopped when she saw a picture of herself. She saw her and her mother walking along the streets of Sudbury. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days ago to talk to her mom about finding her dad and kind of strategies for how to go about doing that. And then Lisa glanced at the caption for this photo and she nearly fell off of her chair. The man and the 2 girls who were the main focus of this photo that Lisa was in were her father and her 2 stepsisters. She just didn't recognize them. She just saw herself in the back of this photo. So purely by chance, after being apart for over a decade, on the only day that Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking to her mom about finding her father, she was literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were looking for her and putting out this ad in the paper to hopefully find her. And this one photo that the photographer took captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa would, of course, read the article and get her father's contact information. She would reach out, and initially Michael actually thought it was a scam and didn't believe this was actually Lisa calling to say, I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury. But eventually he was convinced and he drove right out to Sudbury and he got a chance to meet his grandkids for the first time. And today he and Lisa are still in touch. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting, something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program, he signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing, and right away they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest, and when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie. And so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the New Talent Program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this New Talent Program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. So the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away as he's carrying those groceries that that guy, he's going to be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. You're not going to be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar New Talent Program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, "Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented." By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job, despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job literally holding a book teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, Fred, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity, I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. At the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition, but I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help. And so this director tells Fred, okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it. And so finally, Harry says, okay, fine, I'll go do this thing. And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines. And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself, he was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo. And so Harrison Ford said, all right, I'll play Han Solo. And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with the silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, I missed my bet. and he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the new talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, "You're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired." It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere, as he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card. Michael Packard might be the luckiest or unluckiest person alive. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a flight over Costa Rica when the small plane he was on crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and a passenger were all killed on impact, but Michael and the 4 other passengers, they survived the crash, but they were all left badly injured and stranded in a very remote section of the jungle. The survivors attempted to use the downed plane's radio equipment to send out a distress signal to try to get someone to come out and help them, but they had no way of knowing if anybody was receiving their signal. And so all they could do was just send it out and then wait and hope somebody found them before they all died. And sure enough, 48 hours after crashing, rescuers were able to hack their way deep into the jungle where Michael and the other survivors were, and they were all saved. While Michael was recovering in the hospital, a doctor told him that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night out in that jungle. The chances of even being in a plane crash are astronomically low. The odds are about 1 in 5 million, with some places giving odds as low as 1 in 20 million. To put that in perspective, Michael was far more likely to have been struck by lightning, which is about a 1 in 1 million chance, than he was to have been in that plane crash. But that plane crash would not be the last time that Michael defied the odds and did something totally unbelievable. Over the next couple of decades, Michael, who was a commercial diver by trade, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks off the coast of California. Some of Michael's friends would not be so lucky. Michael would get lost at sea, like really lost, like treading out in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight for hours lost. But miraculously, a boat would find him and save him again. And Michael would discover the body of a long-time missing person hidden underneath the water about 60 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts. But of all the improbable exploits of Michael's life, none is more unbelievable than what happened to him in 2021, which experts are saying he had about a 1 in 1 trillion chance of experiencing. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, who was 57 years old at the time, hopped in a boat with his longtime diving partner, Josiah. Once they were all situated and they had all their equipment inside of the boat, they took off and headed for the open waters right off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where they planned to do some lobster diving. A popular way to retrieve lobsters is to literally just dive down and by hand pick them up and bring them back to the surface. And so that day, that's what Michael and Josiah planned to do. Once they reached this spot right off the coast, Michael put on all of his scuba diving equipment and hopped in the water. Josiah did not put on any diving equipment because he was not going to be getting in the water for this dive. Instead, he would remain on the boat and help Michael get in and out of the water. He'd pull lobsters up onto the boat, and he was also there in case of an emergency, he could call for help. And so just after 6 a.m., once Michael was in the water and signaled he was good to go, he dove down below, and after a little while, he came back up, but with a relatively small haul of lobsters. And so the two men figured that, well, I guess today is just not a great day for catching lobsters. But regardless, for the next couple of hours, Michael continued to go down and catch as many lobsters as he possibly could. By 8 a.m., Michael had captured approximately 100 pounds of lobsters that were now in the boat. And so Michael and Josiah were actually starting to feel pretty good about this particular trip. And so Michael decided he would go back down one more time and try to get just a few more lobsters before they called it a day. And so Josiah remembers watching Michael, who was in the water, as he put his mouthpiece back in. He signaled up to Josiah that he was good to go, and Josiah watched as he disappeared below the surface. The water was very calm, and Josiah is just kind of scanning out across the water, and then all of a sudden this eruption of white water came rushing up to the surface right where Michael had gone down below. And so right away Josiah leaned out over the edge of the boat to see if he could look down and see his friend, but he didn't see Michael anywhere. Instead, he saw something massive moving around underneath them. After Michael had broken the surface on this final dive down to get more lobsters, his plan was to sink down to the bottom of the ocean at about 60 feet and then go hunting for lobsters. But when he had descended to about 45 feet, he felt something smash into him from behind that felt like a truck hitting him, and then everything around him went totally pitch black. The impact of whatever it was that hit him had caused his mouthpiece to get blown out of his mouth. So he doesn't have air, and he starts fumbling around to find his mouthpiece, but he can't find it. And as he's fumbling around, his hands are making contact with what feels like walls all around him. He was inside of an enclosed space. But when he had touched these walls, they were not normal walls. They were soft, but they were hard at the same time, and they seemed to be moving, like they were pulsating or quivering. The space he was in was fairly large, and it was not completely flooded with water. It was like Michael had slipped into this air pocket. But this air pocket was not stationary. It was moving, and pretty fast, because the water that was inside of it was violently sloshing all around. Michael could hear it slapping up against the walls. As Michael continued to panic and fumble around for his mouthpiece, he started to notice intense pressure on his legs, but he had no idea what was causing it, and because it's pitch black, he couldn't see what it was. Finally, Michael found the line that was connected to his mouthpiece. He jammed it in his mouth and he took a long inhale, and now that he could breathe again, he had this horrifying thought. Have I been swallowed by a shark? He instinctively began feeling around for the shark's teeth, but there were no teeth inside of this space. Instead, it was just these walls that continued to shift and move all around him, and that's when it dawned on him. He had been swallowed, but not by a shark. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. Despite their enormous size, they can be up to 60 feet long and weigh up to 70,000 pounds, they only eat small fish. So when this particular whale realized Michael was not a tiny fish, it began violently swinging its head side to side to try to dislodge Michael, and that caused that eruption of white water to go to the surface that Josiah saw. And after a few good shakes, Michael was spat out of this whale's mouth. Michael remembers suddenly being in the open water with enough light coming down that he could see around him. The water was very turbulent and churning, and he recalled as he made his way to the surface, looking straight down and seeing the tail fin of this enormous whale swimming away from him. Michael made his way to the surface and he flagged down Josiah, who boated over to him. He pulled him back into the boat, and Michael, who was totally traumatized by what happened, could only say to Josiah that he was inside of it and that it tried to eat him. After Josiah brought Michael back to shore and called the authorities, Michael was rushed to a hospital where he was evaluated, and unbelievably, he suffered really no injuries. He had some significant bruising to his legs where the whale had actually clamped down on him. That was the pressure he felt in his legs. The mouth of the whale was closing on his legs. But besides that, there really wasn't any other injuries. And so later that day, he was discharged. It's believed the whale was a juvenile that had been seen in the area that was about 30 to 35 feet long, and that had just accidentally scooped Michael up. The whale was certainly not trying to hurt Michael. Whales, especially humpback whales, are not in the business of hurting people. But in this exchange with Michael, Michael could have very easily died. He could have drowned or suffocated inside the mouth of this whale, or he could have just died from blunt force trauma. But luckily he didn't. Despite how terrifying this incident sounds, Michael was incredibly casual in all of his interviews about this. He just kind of acted like, these things kind of happen, whales come out of nowhere, they just scoop you up, it happens. And he would tell the incredulous reporters who just could not believe this guy was real that as soon as he was better, he was getting back in the water and going lobster diving. On the evening of January 6th, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is an area just west of Denver, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. After running into the terminal and getting checked in and getting through security, he made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. Feeling very relieved, Harold joined the queue queue of other people that were getting on the ramp to go down into the plane, and then just a couple of minutes later, he stepped on board and he found his seat, which was located at the front right side of the plane. He sat down in his seat, he buckled in, and then he grabbed an in-flight magazine from the back pocket of the chair in front of him, and he waited for takeoff. 15 minutes later, as the plane was rumbling down the runway at full speed, Harold looked out the window. And so as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away as they got higher and higher up. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, Harold noticed something very odd out of his window. Located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. Now, this was a beautiful scenic drive that Harold was very familiar with, but this road was not maintained in the wintertime. So if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. Yet, as Harold looked out of his plane window down to Jefferson County below, and he kind of scanned his way west up into the Rockies, he saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. And so Harold's thinking to himself, why in the world would anyone be on the Guanella Pass in the middle of this huge snowstorm? It didn't make any sense. But as Harold watched this vehicle, he saw what was going on. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. This motorist was trapped. Harold knew the likelihood of another plane happening to fly over this area and looking down and seeing those lights and recognizing them for what they were, an emergency, were slim to none. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And so Harold quickly got up from his seat, he climbed over the person next to him, he got into the aisle, and he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. And so the attendant took him very seriously. They turned around, they went into the cockpit, and they told the pilots, and the pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground. And then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, who was driving in a four-wheel drive SUV, arrived at the start of this 22-mile stretch of mountain pass, and as they're driving through the whipping snow, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle. And so he drives right up alongside this vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And so Dave, he parks his SUV, he hops out, and he rushes over to the driver's side window of this vehicle. And inside is a terrifying 30-year-old man named Phillips, who was a mechanic who lived in the area. Now, at the time, it was the middle of the night, it's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the winds are whipping, the snow is coming down, and Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. So had Harold not spotted his flashlight SOS signal from the plane, it's almost guaranteed that Alan would have died that night from hypothermia. And so when Alan turned and saw Dave standing there, his rescuer, Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. When Dave asked Alan what happened, Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar, and then when it was time to come home, he had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home, forgetting that this particular stretch of road was not maintained during the winter. When Dave asked Alan how he got this really deep bruise on his cheek, he assumed he got it from crashing off the side of the road, Alan smiled a kind of embarrassed smile and said, "No, actually, after I got stuck, I needed to urinate, and so I got out of the vehicle and I walked a few paces away from my truck and I went to the bathroom, and then when I turned to walk back, the snow was so blinding I couldn't actually see my truck, and I ran to go find it again because I didn't want to be trapped out in the snow, and I ran into the truck face first, and so my cheek hit the door of the truck." And so Dave, he just smiled and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. However, as it would turn out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. The truth was, earlier in the evening that Alan would eventually get stuck, he had murdered 2 hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the Guanella Pass. Both of these murders had gone cold, but in late 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. Several hours before Alan got rescued, he picked up 22-year-old Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking, and after she got into his truck, it's believed he held her at gunpoint and then put zip tie handcuffs on her wrists, and then we don't really know what happened next, but at some point that night, Annette was taken out of the vehicle and led into the woods, and she was shot in the back, and she was left face down in a stream. A couple of hours after he killed Annette, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, and when she got into his truck, it's believed he did the same thing. He held her at gunpoint and put her in zip tie handcuffs. However, Barbara was able to break out of her restraints. It's believed she struck Alan in the cheek, which is why he got that deep bruise on his cheek, and then she leapt out of his car and started running. But Alan got out, chased her down, and shot her in the chest, killing her, and then he dumped her body off the side of this cliff down into the snowbank below. So the only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders, and he likely just didn't understand how dangerous this pass was, and so shortly after turning onto it, his truck slid off the road and he got stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these 2 murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Assuming he did it, that Alan killed these 2 women, we don't know what his motivations were. It's not clear, he hasn't said, and we also don't know if there are potentially other victims. Just after midnight on June 22nd, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around, and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.